John, thanks for coming on the show.
Great pleasure. Yeah. Nice to meet you, Joe. I look forward to contributing to the podcast.
Great. Who are you?
So my name is John Underhill. I am a professor at Aberdeen University, and my job title is University Director for Energy Transition.
What does that imply? What do you do?
Well, I'm actually a geophysically minded geologist. I have a career that spanned 4 decades or more now, mainly in academia. I did work in industry for 5 years, having completed a PhD and an undergraduate degree in geoscience. Uh, I originally took an academic position at Edinburgh University, then moved to Heriot-Watt University in the same city, where I was the chief scientist, and then subsequently moved to Aberdeen just over 4 years ago to take up this position as the director of energy transition for the university.
How was it working in the industry when you were in it?
It was very vibrant, very buoyant. We're talking now back in the late 80s. The North Sea was uh, a prolific basin at the time, or around that time. It was the fourth largest producing basin in the world. So it's very changed days as the basin has moved on beyond the point where, both in terms of oil and gas, it was self-sufficient for the country in the early 2000s, up to and including the early 2000s, I should say, and then has been on a decline of production where we have become more dependent, ever increasingly dependent on imports rather than our own natural resource. So I was fortunate to work at that time within a basin that was still on the up with a lot of exploration, appraisal, development, and indeed production opportunities. Now we've moved to repurposing the basin using the subsurface for different purposes. So the skill sets, however, that in geoscience and engineering are as equally important today as they were then.
How much do you think working in industry helped you with your academia?
Oh, enormously. Um, you can go on a sort of academic pathway where you never interact with industry. I think it's really important that if you're going to be credible, authentic, and relevant to uh, the sector, then actually you can't just talk the talk. You must walk the walk and have interacted with industry in a meaningful way. And so I've tried to do that throughout my career. I took a sabbatical in the early 90s when I was at Edinburgh, and commuted to Glasgow to work in BP's offices for 18 months. That actually led to some academic publications uh, because I was afforded the privilege and opportunity by BP then to do a deep dive into their data sets, be that seismic, well data, to work with people in biostratigraphy and the like, that enabled me to do things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to do in academia. I did a subsequent professorial fellowship in Norway with Norsk Hydro in their research offices in Bergen for 3 years, and I think it has helped me personally and professionally to remain sharp, um, academically sharp, technically sharp, and have a deep appreciation for what the industry provides and the data, incredible data sets that it acquires, and many of which go into the public domain now after a few years through the NSDA's good offices, the National Data Repository, and so on. So that is an amazing opportunity to understand the subsurface, to do geological studies beyond my wildest expectations. There's no way that, as an academic, that I would be able to acquire those sorts of seismic data, well data, and the like. But the fact that they are acquired by industry, go out into the public domain, and people like me can access them is an amazing opportunity, and for students too, to learn from, to research, and then develop outputs through presentation and publication that makes them more competitive for employment thereafter.
Just out of my own curiosity, what does a day to day entail for John Underhill?
And no single day is the same as the last. You can go into a day thinking it's going to be, oh, I'm going to do research on this today, and never get there because, and particularly at this time, Joe, uh, energy has become center stage. I'll be very frank with you. 10 years ago, people probably looked to me as some sort of geo geek, plowing a bit of a lonely, irrelevant furrow. Folk could consider academics of no commercial value. And then things have changed significantly, not necessarily for the right reasons. We can think of 2022. Suddenly people on the number one, number two bus in Aberdeen were talking about, oh, I didn't know we got our energy from there. Oh, that's the value of the North Sea. I I would say that each and every day is different because suddenly a media inquiry might come in regarding the intervention I made, for instance, on infrastructure-led permits or on zonal pricing, or as happened earlier this week, on pylons in Essex. It is suddenly become energy, this is center stage. And I've always prided myself on collecting the data and evidence and being able to present it to whoever, of whichever, any political persuasion, or people that show an interest, be it media or policymakers or others. Really important that the scientific integrity is there of the data and evidence, and you present it without fear or favor. And for me, being an academic, having that independent role is absolutely crucial in this regard, because hopefully government and others will take note of relevant research being undertaken, which is presented in a fair and equitable way.
Why do you think energy has become center stage, though?
I think there's been a realization belatedly of how important it is for wealth creation, quality of life, and the well-being of countries. I am actually shaped, I think, I'm old enough just to remember 1973, 74. I remember the oil crisis, petrol pump queues, the strikes of the coal mines, and the 3-day week. It seems extraordinary now to think back to that, but we were for a period of 6 weeks or 7 weeks from about late January to March in 73, 74 of having a 3-day week. And I did my homework by candlelight. That shapes one. You remember that. And so I've been passionate about energy from that time forward. The North Sea and the UK continental shelf in totality, so West of Shetlands, East Irish Sea, places that don't sometimes appear on people's radar because people talk generally about the North Sea. But the whole of the UK continental shelf has given us a lot. And frankly, I think we have taken it for granted because it gave so much. So I'm one of these, my kids will probably roll their eyes, but say, yeah, Dad, you have been like this all along. Because like whenever they turn on electricity, the power switch and the light comes on, I say, isn't it good? We've got that. Where does it come from? I think there is a real need for a public dialogue for people to understand and appreciate where not only our electricity comes from, but also our total energy, and they are, different things, and the contribution that the oil and gas sector provides in all its shapes and forms. And I think that has been for a long time, Joe, underappreciated. And then black swan moments, be it Ukraine, be it the Straits of Hormuz, or indeed back in 2013, something that's not commonly known, but there was a cold snap. There was snow in Brighton Beach that made headlines. What didn't make headlines was that we were 5 hours away as a country of running out of gas. We were waiting on a LNG, liquid natural gas delivery, coming to South Wales, Southwest Wales, Milford Haven, Pembroke Dock, from Qatar. And it arrived with hours to spare. And you can go to Hansard, and the Energy Secretary, it's basically standing up, and I paraphrase here, of course, but, phew, it's all right, it's arrived. Had that not come, we could have had a power cut. Even in January of last year, we as a country and the government paid over the odds for gas from two gas-fired power stations to ensure that we had sufficient supply of gas for our electricity system to keep the lights on at that stage. I think there has been a greater appreciation for, as I say, the wrong reasons, Ukraine being one of them, what energy gives us, what oil and gas sector gives us. That's not universally accepted, but I think there is a wider public perception and knowledge about this now than there has been for a long, long time.
Let's talk about oil and gas, actually. What is the role it's got for this transition then?
So let me go back one stage to go forward there, Joe. If we look at the UK, 3/4 of our total energy consumption now is still with oil and gas. It used to be oil, gas, and coal. But that's an amazing figure, is it not? 3/4 of our total energy is dependent on oil and gas. We can either deny that, we can ignore it. It's like a moose's head on the table for some people. It's so gruesome that people say, oh, I don't want to go near that. No. Or what we could do instead is say, we've got a moose's head on the table. Crikey, what are we going to do about that? So for me, I know that's a very strange analogue. I've probably brought it into the conversation, but for me, we cannot deny that oil and gas is as crucial as it is for total energy. And even if we look at the electricity system, last year, on average, if we look across the whole year, gas supplied something like 30% of our needs. On those days when it's dark, it's cold, it's windless, so winter, February, early February nights, gas can be our base load, providing our base load for electricity for over 50% of our needs. So when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, we do need base load, and that largely is either gas, nuclear, sun pumped hydro, or all three. So for me, if you just look at the UK, oil and gas still has such a significant role that we have to ask the question, as we transition, as we transform into a new energy system, as the North Sea naturally declines, big fields were found first, and we're going towards the end game, we have to have oil and gas as part of the conversation in the transition. We cannot ignore it. And, maybe we'll come back to this point about what role can and should oil and gas play in the national conversation, the government conversation, as we transition and go towards a lower carbon future. And I'll expand this a little bit because, I'll focus there. Perhaps some people would say parochially on the UK. But if we look globally, over 4/5 of our total energy needs globally come from fossil fuels currently, oil, gas, and coal. And it's like, who knew? But this is really important that we actually have a clear-eyed acceptance that is the inconvenient reality. That is the starting point where we are now on our journey. We may not wish that to be where we're starting from, but it is. So we should not ignore that fact and think very, very carefully about how we transition and avoid it being a cliff edge, but also seeking to ensure that we're doing something that is right by the climate as we're making that progress from where we are now to where we need to be in the future. So it's very much oil and gas, I think, has to be part and parcel of the conversation. And of course, there have been political parties that said they've got a presumption against oil and gas, for example. And a presumption doesn't mean that oil and gas can't and shouldn't be part of it, but the presumption is it ideally wouldn't be. But it is. So we can't just say, no, oil and gas bad, renewables good. There is much more of an and rather than an or, and how do we actually get to a robust, reliable, and secure energy system in the future in the UK and indeed globally that allows wealth creation, quality of life, to enables those things to happen, but at the same stage doesn't leave people behind, because communities and countries can suffer. And we're already seeing, for instance, with the Straits of Hormuz, that places like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Philippines are suffering from not being able to have delivery of oil and gas products from the Gulf. And in Philippines, they declared a national emergency.
I've seen that actually. It is one of them, isn't it? I know the word transition's thrown around quite a lot, but I'm a bit more of an advocate for addition before we worry about transition.
Yes.
How
Yes.
important is that in this day and age?
Um, so let me just clarify what you mean by addition. Do you mean of oil and gas, or do you
More of
mean of
everything.
different?
Just
Yeah.
more of
So
everything.
I'm the same as you. I think we've got to be thinking about all energy and all technologies being in the mix, and let's evaluate. I'll use a sort of simple-minded an analogy, if you like, that we have to think also about the sense of place. What will work in one place will not in another. What do I mean by that? If you're in the Great Glen, then actually use of pumped hydro, um, so reservoirs at height going through turbines to create power in that instance will work. But if you're in East Anglia, that isn't going to work.
Mm.
So different places um, are going to be able to lean into the energy mix that we need. And I would say don't rule anything out. Wave, tidal, nuclear, solar, wind, oil and gas, hydro, all these things should be in the mix, and indeed carbon storage as well. So although that doesn't produce energy or power in and of itself, what it might do is allow us to decarbonize, for instance, gas-fired power stations and store those emissions safely in the subsurface. So even a technology that doesn't produce power or energy as such is also important in the mix. So yeah, I would agree with you. Addition, don't rule anything out. Do the research. Ensure that you're again clear-eyed about what the data, evidence, and interpretation thereof show. That is really important because, quite understandably, there are companies and trade bodies that will champion their own technology. And again, this is a really important thing for academia. I think that there have to be reliable witnesses that are gathering the data and evidence, interrogating it, and then presenting it to ministers and the like by if you're fortunate enough to be given an audience where you can knock on the door and say, Minister, I know you don't want to hear this, but I think you need to know the following, and get an opportunity to table that, then I think it is commensurate on people like me to do so. We have a role, we have a responsibility, and we mustn't shirk from it.
Let's talk about emissions actually. Ultimately, we are lowering ours on paper. But what's happening elsewhere when we're lowering them?
Well, let's look at the UK scorecard. In fact, what I'll do first, Joe, is unpick this a little bit because it may surprise some of your listeners to know that the way in which emissions are calculated are on a country by country by country basis. So that was introduced, I think, for the best of reasons in terms of trying to show how countries were performing in lowering their emissions. but it does have some unintended consequences. And I think we need to think about whether that scorecard is still fit for purpose. So, in the case of the UK, in the period from 1990 to the present day, we have over halved our greenhouse gas emissions over that time. Uh, One of the key elements to that has been to wean ourselves off coal. We as a country now, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, only produce less than 1% of the global total. In other words, 99% of global emissions are other countries from around the world. So, in many ways, I think you can argue that the UK has done a good job by the climate and reducing emissions. There are consequences of this, though. Because of the scorecard that I mentioned before, we could close down a lot of our industry. Let's imagine cement and concrete. They probably face an existential crisis because of the carbon footprint, carbon emissions that are attached to that particular sector. We could, because of the scorecard, close it down and see our UK emissions drastically reduced. Would we still use cement and concrete? I'd argue we would in
Absolutely.
building train vessels. Where would we get it from? We'd get it from overseas, which comes with a higher carbon footprint than our own domestic supplies. So, in other words, we're going to import it from Germany, Poland, wherever, because we need it. Our scorecard is going to look better, but we will have closed industries. People will have been laid off. We wouldn't have been raising the taxes domestically that would come in otherwise. And we wouldn't have necessarily the security of supply if we're trying to import it from overseas. It might go to, the highest bidder elsewhere, as opposed to if it's in our own backyard, be able to use that. So emissions, I think, is more complicated than folk make out, and it's driven partly, perhaps, more than it should be by the way in which they are calculated. So we could see decarbonisation in this country continue, but it could lead to drastic deindustrialisation and, in fact, be worse for the global climate because overall the emissions tally globally would go up by the very fact that we're importing it from overseas and all the inherent carbon emissions that come with the transportation and importation process.
So ultimately, we're prioritizing how we look over the needs of what we are. Well, not so much the needs. We're prioritizing how it looks on paper than what it really means for the country. Then are we really?
I wouldn't put it in quite the same terms because I think that people are um, trying to do the best they can to decarbonize. It is unfortunate that what we do in this country, if we then revert or replace what we produce domestically with imports, that in fact it's worse for the global climate, but it doesn't appear so on the
Mm.
scorecard. So, yeah, I struggle a little bit with the words that you use there because I think people are trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
But actually, we need to have that global conversation because if what we're doing in this country is actually only exacerbating the emissions elsewhere, in whichever country that we derive those imports from, we are not doing things right by the global climate. So uh, maybe we can come back into the oil and gas piece here because if we look at domestic oil and gas, it has the carbon footprint it does. It is higher, admittedly, than piped gas imports from Norway. But domestic oil and gas production has a lower carbon footprint than imports of liquid natural gas from overseas. places like Qatar, Trinidad, Egypt, Angola, Algeria, and the USA, where a lot of that gas that we import is also fracked gas, something that we ban in this country, but willingly import with a higher carbon footprint just from the imports, let alone thinking about the fracking aspect of it. Again, who knows? Who knew that we are doing that and replacing potentially domestic oil and gas, which has a lower carbon footprint than the LNG, in so doing. So there are things that we can do with the oil and gas sector in the UK continental shelf and the North Sea to reduce its carbon footprint. We could minimize flaring to only what's needed in terms of safety on offshore rigs, potentially electrify more offshore, and do the carbon storage piece as well to ensure that emissions are not going into the atmosphere. In so doing, one, two, or all three of the things I've just suggested, we could force down the carbon intensity of the North Sea yet further. However, this is also quite an unspoken good news story that the industry, the sector, have been pursuing a decarbonising route for oil and gas, and the carbon intensity of the North Sea is much lower than it was, 5 or 10 years ago, and the fact that the industry is as heavily regulated as it is helping to police and drive that down. So for me, there is still a very strong case for domestic oil and gas because, again, we use it for that 75% of total energy and gas for, on average, 30% last year for our power supply, electricity. So while we still need it, why not exploit the resources that you have domestically that give you the energy security, give you the tax revenues, support the jobs, support the supply chain. And as I've said, if we don't use that, particularly the gas from the North Sea and the wider continental shelf, we're going to import more LNG at a higher carbon footprint. So actually, I know that this sounds a bit counterintuitive, and many people would raise an eyebrow at this, but our own domestic gas has a lower carbon footprint than those imports, and so it's actually better for the global climate than importing the stuff that we would use and need that society currently demands.
Yeah, because playing devil's advocate here, actually, I know our rules and our legislations in this country, just from experience, are pretty strict in regards to our production of oil and gas. And the way I'm looking at it is, if, you know, on paper, as most of this seems to come down to, is we're looking like we're doing the job, so to speak, but you've got no control over where these countries, likes of Africa, etc., and what their emissions are. Let's be frank. I mean, India, for example. I mean, obviously, a rising economy at the moment. They're building coal plants left, right, and center. Cheaper energy ultimately helps with your manufacture, helps with your economy, etc., etc. But even the production of oil and gas, etc., in that kind of region, they've not got the same legislation. I know we don't import anything. Well, there was talk. Obviously, we were getting a lot of our oil via Russia at one point, but I don't know obviously how true some of that is. Um, but you can't control any of that. So, like you're saying, and I guess to some extent, it just a lot of it seems like it's to please a certain ideology.
Again, I hesitate a little bit because there is no doubt that carbon emissions are going up. Look at the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it is important that we try to not only arrest, but reverse that upward trend. So I am much more sympathetic to the idea that we do need to decarbonize, but I'm also pragmatic, practical, and solution-based, and think, well, actually, oil and gas shouldn't be demonized. It's part of the mix. Let's try and decarbonize that and also have that clear-sighted, open-eyed view about, well, how are emissions calculated? And also think around where would we be as a country if the North Sea and other basins around the continental shelf had not given us what they have. If I take you back to my earlier comment about the mid-70s, the Chancellor of Exchequer at the time was going cap in hand regularly to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to get bailouts for this country. From the late 70s through the 80s into the 90s, what the North Sea gave us was that prosperity largely unseen because it was offshore. So I think there's a balance here of thinking about what we need to do that's right for society, but also right for global climate and future generations. So I'm not as strident as perhaps you are, Joe, implicit in your comments earlier about the ideology. I do understand what I think people are striving for, but as with most things in life, it's more complicated than it first seems.
Guys, I'm sorry to interrupt the show, and I really hope you're enjoying it. One thing I'm going to ask you, if you're listening to it and you're not liking, following or subscribing to it, could I ask a massive favour that you do? It really helps the show, it helps me bring in more people, and it helps me get more stories out there, which in favour brings more stories back in. Let's get back to it. John, one of the things you haven't mentioned is touching on how UK decarbonising by moving away from coal, but it cost a lot of communities in the past. Are we doing the same now with oil and gas?
I fear that we are. If you look at Aberdeen and the northeast and the dependency that the city has either directly or indirectly on jobs associated with the sector, you only have to look at property prices, for example, compared to the UK national average, and see the significant misalignment in the sense that the property prices have diminished much faster and to a larger extent in Aberdeen and surrounds than in other parts of the UK, as the industry has contracted and a number of companies have left. I mean, you look around the city as well, and Shell's Talos complex has been razed to the ground. I was up at Hill of Rubislaw recently, and the Marathon offices there are now being taken down. So, yeah, I'm seeing a direct impact in and around the city. And if you talk to charities like the Cyrenians, the level of fuel poverty and deprivation being seen across the city is very large. You mentioned about the coal industry and communities feeling sort of left behind as the sector that employed them and made their area prosperous was closed. It would mean that people would have to move. That there are folk that are displaced effectively as a result of this. You can think of the sort of Clydebank shipyards closing and people then actually moving to Aberdeen to take employment in oil and gas, and families being uprooted. My personal experience of this is that originally I'm from Portsmouth, and the dockyard there was the mainstay of so many jobs. When the dockyard closed, the city even got its own minister. Such was the significance that was seen at the time, because the closure of that led to all sorts of indirect consequences be it newsagents, bakeries, all sorts of things. So I am concerned that the transition to a new energy future is having an adverse impact on places and people, and we need the transition to be managed and orderly in order to be just. What I think I've seen is that it's unmanaged, disorderly, and unjust, and places like Aberdeen that have been at the mainstay of the oil and gas sector are facing that before there is a replacement in place for the skills and the supply chain in renewables and other areas. There isn't other sectors coming in to take on the people that were employed currently. So I do fear that we have not learned the lessons of past mistakes made, and that is impacting places like Aberdeen. But we should also remember that those that are employed in the oil and gas sector are drawn from across the UK. Yes, we see the tangible outcome, the consequences in Aberdeen, but folk travel up from Teesside, Wearside, Merseyside, across the country to go offshore. And if those jobs are not there, then that is also going to impact the communities and places where they live themselves.
Yeah, what I guess we probably touched on it a wee bit there is it's one of my kind of pet annoyances is the skills side of things,
Mm-hmm.
transitioning from oil and gas to renewables. Um, Fortunately, I can actually probably speak a bit on it because I do both. I do oil and
Mm-hmm.
gas and I do
Mm-hmm.
renewables. My honest view is I can't see renewables filling the gap of in terms of the amount of oil and gas jobs that say that were to be lost. I can't see renewables filling that void.
Yeah, they're very different sectors, I would say. And the other thing is, as we touched upon earlier in the podcast, that if you're bringing in a lot of the manufacturing construction from overseas, then the jobs wouldn't necessarily be in the UK. And I'll give you an example of this, that there is a floating offshore wind farm demonstrator. You could see it from the coast in Stonehaven, just south of Aberdeen. That was originally manufactured in the UAE. It was then brought, the blades and the like were brought across to Rotterdam and constructed and towed out into the North Sea without ever setting foot on dry land in the UK. And no jobs effectively, very, very limited, um, largely in office based in Aberdeen and small numbers there. So the comparison between the job intensity and variety of jobs in the oil and gas industry compared to renewables, if you take that as an example, it is a concern. Where are the blade manufacturers based in the UK or solar panel constructions and so on? The other thing is, I would say, Joe, is I think a lot of the jobs which are in almost sort of further education and apprenticeships, welders, construction, these things, they perhaps map on more easily than, say, in geoscience and arguably in engineering as well. Although I can see that in engineering, construction, electrical engineering, and the like, that there are opportunities. But it actually would be in some of the technical disciplines actually need retraining and a boost to educational programs and making that attractive to school children to take degrees or apprenticeships in higher or further education to do them. But like you say, I have concerns that the the sheer numbers of jobs and variety and intensity of those jobs compared to renewables is on a different level.
Yeah. So I'm gonna keep my names nameless, but I've worked on two wind farms in the UK, for
Mm-hmm.
example. Um, the one I'm working on now, I'm like I say, the monopiles and jackets manufactured in China, brought over
Mm-hmm.
on Chinese vessels. The construction works are being done by European companies.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you're on the construction vessel, for example, that I'm on, um, it's in British waters at the moment. But I think across the board, there's probably about 10, maybe 15 people on that vessel out of 300 that are Brits. And that's by no fault. Obviously, at the end of the day, it's by, these construction contractors at the end of the day, you go with the work. They're not going to turn around and go, oh, no, we can't go there because it's Britain, etc., etc. At the end of the day, you've got to make money. But we don't have uh, a construction base here in the UK
Mm-hmm.
in that
Mm-hmm.
regards. So even after these things are built, even after all the cables are run, turbines are in, etc. I'm just using wind as an example. Once the farm is up and running, it's not actually a huge amount of people required to maintain them. And you're talking one
Yeah.
vessel probably that sits in the field the whole time. And then obviously, you're trucking boys in and out, boys and girls, sorry, in and out every
Mm-hmm.
2 weeks. That's not one farm. Maybe let's just say for to be conservative, I don't know, 50, 60 people you're probably
Mm-hmm.
going to need to look after it. I've been on platforms in the North Sea, which at any one time we've got over 120 people sitting on board.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I personally think this is one of the things that I think the government needs to be more honest about is you can't the skills aren't really too transferable. There's certain things you can transfer within, I think. I found ways to jump between the two. But I think, yeah, the idea that people are just gonna you'd be able to jump out of an oil and gas job and straight into to working on wind is in my opinion it's false promises.
I have seen that firsthand, Joe. So maybe I'll share this experience. I was fortunate to be asked to be the chair of something called the National Energy Skills Accelerator, which is actually a partnership between Aberdeen University, Robert Gordon University, North East Scotland College, Skills Development Scotland, and ETZ Limited. Now, the aim with that was to build some of the skills base in terms of programs for either unemployed or employed workers in oil and gas that wish to translate, so to upskill or reskill, so that they would be competitive for jobs in the renewable industry. And we applied to the Scottish Government and actually won £1 million from the Scottish Government's Just Transition Fund to put on those courses. The first thing I'll say is that we as a university and our partners, we needed to be actually quite humble because it often, I think in education, we put things on and assume that what we're doing is right for the industry. So my first lesson here was that to realize the gaps in what we currently could offer and work then with practitioners in industry to identify the gaps and then fill them to ensure that the programs and courses that we put on were actually relevant and aligned with the upskilling, reskilling that was needed. At the end of the day, we were able to put on over 700, well, fund, so make free over 700 places for those unemployed oil and gas workers, or indeed those in oil and gas that wanted to repurpose, to upskill and reskill. Um, that we felt also was a way of providing some hope and to ensure that we were doing something relevant, that we didn't lose people with skills that could, if they wished to, seek to translate into renewables. But having said all that, if renewable jobs are not available for all the reasons that you've said, then they may be, upskilled, reskilled, and competitive for those jobs. But if they're not there, they have to look for them elsewhere. And if I extend that a little bit further, I am seeing with oil and gas workers that they're now seeing that their skills are still useful and usable, but overseas.
Yeah.
And the same with the supply chain. I think the supply chain had the hope that the renewable sector in the UK would be their natural business in the future. But instead, what I'm seeing in and around Aberdeen, in a sense of sort of survival, is they're seeking overseas contracts in Guyana or Namibia or wherever, because that's where the business is. And the Unite, the union, I think it's Unite, came up with a no ban of oil and gas without a plan. In terms of a plan for renewables, if that is not there and the jobs aren't there and the work isn't there, then those companies, particularly in the supply chain, aren't going to sort of wither and die. They're going to look for opportunities elsewhere. So what I am seeing is that even those people that have upskilled and reskilled aren't finding renewable work, and so are reverting, if you like, to oil and gas, all being lost to the sector. But if they stay in oil and gas, the supply chain and other companies are seeking opportunities abroad, and those workers with the appropriate skills have a decision to make of whether they do that as well, or decide to do something else, or indeed, retire. And we see a change in the demographic to the workers that we have available to us, the skills pool, if you like, that's available.
How many years do we have left of North Sea oil and gas, John?
All depends on the fiscal regime, really. In terms of the subsurface, you can go to point to reports like the Westward one recently that gave a low, medium, and high estimates of the resource that remains. And in order to release that resource, you need two things. One is that the discoveries already made can be tied back into the existing infrastructure. And secondly, that there are opportunities for either near-field exploration or infrastructure-led exploration. And of course, the current government had in its manifesto that there would be no new licenses and no exploration, and have also retained something called the EPL, the Energy Profits Levy, the windfall tax that was brought in at the time of the price spike following the Ukraine war, the conflict there breaking out, but didn't remove it when windfall conditions no longer applied. Without the removal of the EPL, my sense is that industry consider the UK continental shelf uninvestable, and they don't have that political certainty or fiscal certainty. So even if tiebacks were allowed to existing infrastructure, which is the direction of travel that we're currently on with the government, that in and of itself won't move the dial and see those existing discoveries tied back and coming into the UK unless the windfall tax, the UPL, is removed and replaced with something else. And there is a something else that has been proposed, and that was a discussion between industry and government and called the oil and gas price mechanism, which basically says that if prices are over $90 a barrel or 90p a therm for gas, the windfall conditions would apply and a higher tax rate would operate. But if it was below that level, then the windfall conditions wouldn't apply, and there would be a greater take for the companies that would allow them to invest in the North Sea. So this is a roundabout way of answering your question. Your question is, how much is left in the North Sea? Well, there's enough left to take us to 2050 and beyond. But if we are set on closing the industry down, shutting down infrastructure, then the windfall tax still applying is meaning that that's going to happen sooner rather than later. And if infrastructure closes down, we're not going to then recommission it. It's decommissioned and we lose the opportunity. So individual fields, as they're closing down, are examples of this. I can think of a pipeline in the Southern North Sea called the Caister Murdoch Schooner, CMS pipeline,
I've
that
worked on
fed
that one.
into. Did you? It fed into the terminal at Feddlethorpe.
Yeah,
Now,
I've worked on that.
when that was shut in, other producing gas fields and discoveries close to that infrastructure were left behind. They couldn't produce anymore, and others, discoveries, were stranded. So you can have the unintended consequence of closing a piece of infrastructure, and it's not just for the field that it largely was producing from, but all the satellites that feed into it. So we could accelerate the demise of the North Sea by continuing to have the EPL and not having a replacement for that, which gives the fiscal certainty to industry to continue. And let's not forget that if we were to continue our domestic production and also unlock some of the things that I've been describing, discoveries made that are close to infrastructure, and indeed potentially exploration in and around that infrastructure as well, the North Sea could have a longer life. I absolutely accept. I did a lot of work on this, looking at how much oil and gas has been produced from the North Sea in UK sector and the Norwegian sector. And it's very clear that the size of the prize is diminished. The production has seen a decline. Yeah, I said earlier, we were self-sufficient in oil and gas up until the early 2000s. We've seen an inexorable decline since and a more reliance on imports. What that tells me is the basin is mature. Does it mean it's over? No. There are still discoveries and prospects, but it's towards the end game, and you need to be much more aware of what makes a commercial entity, and that is having existing infrastructure rather than building new infrastructure, and being able to tie back into that allows you to extend the basin for longer. So I hope I've given you a direct answer that there is enough in the North Sea to take us to 2050 and beyond, although it's a diminishing resource, but it still could and should be commercial if only the tax conditions made it more attractive for it to be so. And if we did that, we would project energy security, because we're actually producing domestic supplies into the gas system. 100% of the gas that would come from, for instance, Jackdaw, if it were permitted to produce, would come into the UK network. So not only does that give us energy security, it gives us tax raising powers. The revenues that come into Treasury could, should Treasury so wish, government so wish, be used to reduce fuel duty or some of the subsidies on bills. That's a political choice that could be made. In addition to the energy security and the jobs piece, we have obviously the work of the supply chain and the like that comes into it. And to my earlier point, domestic gas, if we don't produce it, we'll replace it from somewhere else whilst we still need it. And that will have a carbon footprint that's higher and worse for the global climate. So there are a number of things that I think point to the North Sea could and should its life be extended, even though it is not the basin that it once was. The big fields were found early. They were produced in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. That's what gave us self-sufficiency in oil and gas. We're no longer there, but it's a basin that still has potential and things to give, particularly in satellites around infrastructure. And if you going back to the Westwood report, they went through forensic detail, went through the discoveries that have been made and not been produced that are on the books at the North Sea Transition Authority, NSTA, and looked at what it would take in order for that gas and that oil to come into the system, domestic supplies, and the big blocker is the taxation issue.
One question I have actually, it's actually just come to mind as we were speaking there is, why has energy become such a them and us thing? Why can't it be like the similar ways to how we think, more of everything? Why does it have to be, it's got to be pro renewables or pro oil and gas? Why can't it be just pro energy?
Well, so I think, Joe, what's happened is energy suddenly, almost from nowhere, has become a very hot political topic from 2022 onwards, in a way that perhaps has not been the case, arguably, since the mid-70s. I would say what that has done is politicise and also seen a polarisation of energy, and particularly of oil and gas, the sort of oil and gas bad, renewables good piece. I, like you, look at it more holistically. I think if we were, if I had a magic wand, I would love to see what has happened, what is the case with the Committee for Climate Change and things like the Bank of England. That is that energy is so important for this country, it shouldn't be looked at on short-term political cycles. We've got to look at it at the long term, and it would be really good to have an independent of government, view on energy that takes the long-term strategic view. It is focused on data and evidence and is aware of, but does not get deflected by any lobby going for a particular technology. We look at everything in a very dispassionate way to try and get to the right outcome that keeps the lights on, keeps the heat going, allows us to have air conditioning in the summer, the quality of life that we've got, tax raising powers that we can use for social benefit. So for me, that would be the fundamental change. Let's make sure that we try and move away from the polarization, move away from the political short-term political cycle, and think about what is the best thing for the country in the medium and long term, and think about the short-term decisions that we take that feed into the medium and long-term benefit of the country.
From everything you're seeing at the moment, day to day wise, how different is the actual reality of this energy transition?
It's hugely challenged. There are, I think it's a good thing that we look at all technologies. You think of hydrogen, for example. People have promoted hydrogen on its sort of green credentials. It seems at face value to be attractive to take water, hydrogen, and oxygen, electrolyze it, get the hydrogen, get the oxygen. There is no carbon. But there are challenges around hydrogen that we need to be clear about. It's very hard to store. It's the smallest molecule that we've got. It appears on the periodic table where it does for a reason. So it's very hard to store. It tends to leak and become diffuse. It embrittles steel. So in terms of engineering, we would need to reconfigure quite a lot of our steel pipes if we were going to use it. That also plays into the physics and chemistry of the molecule. But in addition, we've got to look at the commercial sense it would make or not to change and convert our current methane system to hydrogen. What would it cost? And in fact, because of the electrolysis, it is a expensive mechanism because you put more energy in to get less out. So it's inefficient and expensive. And before we think we can just take seawater, for example, and electrolyze it. Seawater has got sodium and it's salty. It's got sodium and chloride in it. So you'd need to desalinate. That adds more cost. So why am I making this point? I think it's really important that we do a very rigorous scientific test of all these methods before we get carried away with uh, something that appears at face value to be attractive. And don't get me wrong, hydrogen has its uses, particularly in things like fertilizer, and there may be some elements of transport and so on. But before we suddenly uh, pivot towards something else, we need to look at the scientific basis. And in this case, hydrogen is challenged geologically in engineering, physics, chemistry. It doesn't obey, it does obey the basic laws of thermodynamics, but it doesn't help you in this regard.
Yeah.
Then you've got the inefficiency, the expense, and also communities. And we haven't touched upon this very much yet, Joe, but we've got to take communities with us, not for them to be feeling something's being done to them. And I can't help but notice that with hydrogen, a couple of projects have been abandoned, one in Whitby Hydrogen Village near Ellesmere and another one up in Redcar, because there had not been sufficient public engagement, outreach, and communication. And those local communities started to get very angsty about, oh, hydrogen's coming in. And both projects were dropped. The same thing is happening, I would say, with pylons around the wind industry. You've got the offshore wind construction. You still need cabling to the shore, an electricity substation to be built on the beach, and then pylons to be built to connect it to the grid. Communities aren't best pleased. You're in Dundee, I'm in Aberdeen. If you go between those two, you see the protest signs on the road. Again, we've got to have a much more national conversation about energy and inform and educate in a way that actually back in the day, I'm thinking 1970s, 1980s here, there was the dash for gas and a lot of public information films about why would we want to convert to gas cookers, gas hobs, boilers, and so on, and gas-fired power stations for electricity indeed. That public information and awareness piece, I think, is lacking in this transition as well, so that there's a lot of people are wondering why this is being done at the cost it is. And, with the cost of living crisis and people looking at electricity bills or the subsidies that are on those bills, that people are questioning a lot of what is going on. So we have to do a better job collectively and individually of explaining what the process, why we're trying to rewire Britain and the transition. But it is stuttering, I would say, and challenged. And at the same time, we are not appreciating what oil and gas currently gives us or how dependent we are on it. And so potentially closing and ostracizing one sector, which is still vital, and we're importing what we don't produce locally. And we're seeking to accelerate to a transition. And in my considered view would be that we need to have a little less haste to get a bit more speed and get the clarity of decision making, that looking at the data, looking at the evidence to inform policy to make the right choices. And I don't see that at the moment. I live in hope that is going to happen. And folk like me doing the research that we do, the educational piece, it's commensurate on us to try and undertake the relevant work and then translate that into government and communities so that we have a broader national conversation around the transition.
A personal question. What moment in your career stands out as your proudest?
Well, that's a tough one. Let me just think on this a second. I think last year, having collected the data and evidence, looking at licensing for the North Sea, I made an intervention on infrastructure-led permits that led to an engagement with government, and government took on some, not all. They weren't as ambitious as I had proposed, but introduced something called transitional energy certificates as a possibility for extending the life of the North Sea. So for a random academic working away on data and evidence to have traction and influence, and government, to be very fair, treated me well in what I presented, and also included me and named me in the subsequent North Sea energy plan, future plan. So that was it's something I'm delighted that academic research that was done rigorously was able to be tabled, had a good hearing, and led to a change.
That's good to hear. At least someone, well, at least you could take that on the board that they don't do that much listening, but they're listening to you in some regards, then, eh?
I think this is an interesting point, Joe. Being an academic as I have been since 1989. So what is that? 37 years as an academic. I think the research and data that one does and how you interpret it, you build a body of data and evidence. And because I understand industry, having worked before that in industry, but independent and absolutely wedded to the scientific integrity of the data and the evidence and interpretations. That allows me and gives me a privilege, I think, it's a privilege to be in this position, to be able to table these things and get a fair hearing. I can understand that some people would look at folk in industry or trade bodies and say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? But John, why are you saying that? You're an independent academic. And so I pride myself on collecting that data and evidence, and when necessary, holding industry's feet to the fire, pointing things out when the geology or the engineering doesn't work. And an example of that, and in fact, maybe I should have said this in answer to your previous question, I did a piece of work looking at shale gas extraction. I thought, I need to know about this. And so applied for, knowing that the seismic data would go in the public domain, applied for those seismic data from Quadrilla's acreage in Lancashire. And a student and I, Ian Anderson and I, worked that up. And what we found was that that particular area was not conducive to shale gas. It was too shallow. It was like shattered glass in terms of faulting. And that was not something I had anticipated going into the project. Now, when you know something, when you've learned something, it's commensurate upon me as an independent academic to say it. I can't unknow what I know. And so I presented the evidence and the data, which showed that the shale gas horizons were not as continuous as generally perceived. There were lots of faults in the area. It was too shallow. It wasn't the shale gas kitchen was not at 90 degrees depth, deeper depth, and had depressurized. So that led me to look more regionally. And when I say this, it will become obvious. But the oldest rocks in Britain are in Lewis and Harris, west of Scotland. The youngest rocks are in the London Basin and East Anglia. Now, what that shows is that Britain has tilted, and the areas to the west have come up. The further west you go, then, the more uplift there has been. And when you trace the units further across the country and into the North Sea, it became apparent that the age of that uplift was 55 million years ago, when the Atlantic Ocean opened. So actually, the soundbite, if you like, is that fracking could and possibly should have worked in the UK, but we're 55 million years too late.
Oh no.
And when I did that piece of work and presented it and published it, uh, that, as you might imagine, for some folk in the oil and gas sector was uncomfortable. But I feel it's really important that whatever the data and evidence show, whichever direction it takes, you then present it honestly and faithfully. So the integrity of the science, the data and the evidence is crucial to me in this regard, whatever it shows. And so I presented and published that because we could spend a lot of time and money and effort chasing shale gas plays, but actually they're not going to work. And in the Midland Valley of Scotland, are able to demonstrate that the Lothian oil shale that produced oil and gas back in the sort of 60s, it's an outcrop. It's been uplifted. It's been depressurized. So again, fracking in Scotland in some of the oil shale units wouldn't work. Yeah, another couple of things that have happened to me over my career, which I've particularly enjoyed and I think have might be of interest. One is way back when I did a PhD out in Western Greece. I was very fortunate to be able to do that. And a number of years later, I was contacted by a professor of classics and a colleague who had looked at the Homeric text, the Odyssey and the Iliad, and realized that the Odysseus' homeland, ancient Ithaca, might be in the wrong place because the geographical description in those classical Greek texts said that ancient Ithaca, Odysseus' homeland, lay to the west, not to the east, and was low-lying. And I got involved with a geological and geophysical project to test the idea that a valley in the island of Kefalonia was previously separated, caused a separation of the Western Peninsula Paliki from the main body of Kefalonia. It actually led me to, when I realized it was a not some sort of fanciful search for Atlantis, but was a geological and geophysical problem. I and a colleague called Robert Bittlestone, we approached Fugro, a geotechnical company, and effectively they underwrote the project for £1.5 million worth of techniques using their own helicopters, seismic vessels, gravity, personnel. So it was, a really important academic moment, and stressing the academic because a lot of people wouldn't be interested in this sort of stuff, to test the idea that whilst places like Mycenae and Troy had been discovered back in the 19th century, ancient Ithaca, Odysseus' homeland, was the one site that hadn't been rediscovered or found archaeologically and had this geographical inconsistency. And it's a sort of motiveless crime, really. If Ian Rankin writes about Edinburgh, or Colin Dexter writes about Oxford in the Rebus or the Morse books, it's a motiveless crime to get the geography wrong. So Homer, the Homeric text, had effectively done that. Was it a mistake, or was the description in the book right? And did the geology and geophysics stack up? So I've spent quite a lot of my academic career testing that, and been fortunate because Fugro accepted the premise and then rolled up their sleeves and put effort and money into doing that. So the outcome being, and of course this year Christopher Nolan's Hollywood blockbuster is coming out of the same name, Odysseus.
Oh yeah.
We have been able to demonstrate that Western Peninsula indeed was ancient Ithaca. And I know for your listeners it might seem a little bit academic. For people in classical Greek scholarship and English literature and geology and geophysics, this is quite a big thing. And the other thing that I was going to mention to you, some people will know this, but again, back in the day, and we're going back sort of 15 years now, or more actually. I was a professional soccer referee, and I refereed on the Scottish Premier League, and feel very grateful and privileged to have represented Scotland as a FIFA international official and had a career that's at the top level in Scottish football between 1994 and 2008. And the reason I introduced that is, again, this bit about independence, yet having to make decisions. You know, you as a referee gather the data and evidence from your assistant referees, the linesmen, as they were back in the day, the fourth official, and you still have to make a decision. And it might be an unpopular decision, and it's one where you also have to be strong and resilient, because you might have 60,000 people at Ibrox or Parkhead thinking that the decision should go a different way from the one that you have. Going back to the conversation that we've had on reporting out scientific data, evidence, and interpretations, be it on fracking and why it wouldn't work in the UK, or why domestic oil and gas has a lower carbon footprint and could and should be continued to be pursued, even though there is a polarized and political debate that closing down that. I feel that training that I had, the experience that I gained through refereeing to the top level, has held me in good stead. And maybe, just maybe, people from the outside look at that and know about that background and the reality of having been a referee at that level and made the decisions and been fair-minded and equitable has also helped in the conversation around what is sometimes this very polarized and political sensitivity around the oil and gas sector. So I think maybe that's worth just tabling so that you're aware, Joe, that although it's some time ago since I refereed from top level, I retired from top level football, never quite leaves you. And, you know, people, even today, rarely, but even today, sometimes remember, you know, decisions made back in the day or the like. I think hopefully I've gone beyond the point where I have to wear a sort of paper bag over my head on a Monday after a decision made over the weekend. But it certainly has helped, and it does help, I think, in this conversation, the national conversation, political conversation that we need to have around all energy, because there are inconvenient realities that the data and evidence show up, and the independent academic view is helpful in that regard.
Yeah, no, and you know what? It's been great to have you on actually from an independent perspective as well as a knowledge and experience and information perspective. I think it's something that we need more of it out there from maybe a more neutral basis than one side or the other. So thanks so much for coming on, John.
Not at all. And I think that refereeing piece means that I am quite resilient and not a sort of shrinking violet. And I'm happy to put my head above the parapet, but equally, as any good referee should be, if you're shown to have made a mistake, then you've got to hold your hands up. If you make many mistakes, then you're incompetent at that level and shouldn't be, you know, refereeing that level. But if you make an occasional mistake, which people can understand because it was made in real time with one view from one angle and so on at the pace it was, but you don't want an injustice to last, so that you are willing to accept that the decision you first made was more difficult and change one's mind. I would say that's strength. And that's what I take into the scientific piece, that if data and evidence comes to the fore at a subsequent stage that causes me to have to change my interpretation and the interpretation, I think that is good to do. I understand that in the political arena, that might be considered a U-turn. In the scientific arena, it isn't. It is new data has come to the fore. What do you do with that data? You absorb it, and you don't get precious about trying to defend the indefensible, a mistake when refereeing, for example. You respect what the TV cameras or other elements show, and then you say, you know what? In the interests of fair play, in the interests of equity and fairness, that decision needs to be changed. That's what I try to take into my scientific research as well, and try and set up the environment where you welcome challenge, you welcome questioning, and welcome new data coming to the fore. Don't defend something that has had its day because new data has come to the fore. That for me is absolutely fundamental.
Thanks so much, John.